Welcome back to SNAP-Ed LGU Mentor in Your Pocket. I'm your host for today, Macy Helm, the SNAP-Ed coordinator at the University of Nevada, Reno. On today's episode, we will talk about working with your university's Government Affairs Office. Joining us on the show today is our guest, Dr. Carla Shelnut, who leads the SNAP-Ed program at the University of Florida. Welcome, Carla, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
At a high level, can you explain what government affairs oversees within a land-grant university?
Certainly. So the staff in an LGU Government Affairs Office develops relationships at the local, state, and federal level in order to best represent the great work of LGU faculty, students, and staff. So they advocate on our behalf for the interests of the LGU and partner with LGU representatives, such as SNAP-Ed directors, to help tell the story of the great work being done at the LGU across the state. They can also serve as an early warning about new funding or regulations that may impact the work that we do.
That definitely sounds like important work out of that office. And as a SNAP-Ed program leader, what prompted you to want to build a relationship with your university's Government Affairs Office?
So Florida is a really big state, and the University of Florida has numerous programs funded by the state and the feds. I believe as a SNAP-Ed implementing agency that we really need to have a strong relationship with our state agency in Tallahassee and share our impact with legislators at the state and federal levels. I've developed a great relationship with our state governmental affairs office in Tallahassee, which has really helped me over the years connect with upper administration at our state agency to help share great work with them, as well as work together with them to solve problems that may come up. So having that relationship is critical for both good and potentially bad situations. Now, once I learned how important our state governmental affairs team was, I had the opportunity to connect with our federal governmental affairs team in DC. This team is also very important in helping me educate our legislators about the great work that SNAP-Ed does in Florida. The office in DC will set up visits for me when I'm there and attend all of my visits to stay involved in the conversation.
That all makes sense. And so how did you initiate this relationship?
So my dean and extension director at the time was the one who introduced me to our state governmental affairs staff during a difficult contract negotiation with our state agency years ago. It's a great idea to make sure you keep your dean and extension director in the loop if you're interested in connecting with the Governmental Affairs Office. After a while, they'll reach out to you directly with questions and requests for information.
This is really helpful. And so what does working with that Government Affairs Office look like now? Do you have frequent meetings or maybe just share SNAP-Ed materials occasionally?
I typically will text our state and federal teams as things come up, or they will text or call me if something comes up on their end. There has been some turnover at our state agency, so our state governmental affairs office has been helping facilitate meetings between our state agency administrators and my dean and director of extension and myself. So when I'm in Tallahassee or DC for different meetings or events, I'll try to connect with those offices while I'm there, and I'll often add on an extra day for Hill visits and bring materials to share with staffers and legislators.
And so from your experience, are there any other tips you can share with the listeners to build this relationship with their Government Affairs Office?
Sure. Now, as I mentioned before, I would definitely start with connecting with the extension director at your university. Let them know that you're interested in developing this relationship and ask them for an introduction. You'll need to be willing to travel to where they are and communicate with them regularly so that they know your program and so that you are the first person they think of when they have questions about SNAP-Ed or nutrition education. Make it a priority to create a nice infographic to use when you visit offices on the Hill with your governmental affairs staff. They also love to share those materials.
Well, these are great tips. And thank you so much for sharing your experience at UF and how you built this partnership within your own university.
Of course, I'm happy to share. Thanks again for having me.
And thank you all for listening. We hope that you learned something new today. And next month, we will get to hear from the federal representative for University of Florida's Government Affairs Office to learn more about building these relationships for SNAP-Ed programming. We look forward to seeing you next time on SNAP-Ed LGU Mentor in Your Pocket. You can find the podcast on the E-Extension SNAP-Ed Resource Center at snap-edresources.extension.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved, are not a legal or expert interpretation by, an endorsement of, and do not necessarily represent those of South Dakota State University, the South Dakota Board of Regents, E-Extension, a SNAP-Ed state agency, the Food and Nutrition Service, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, or the United States Department of Agriculture and their employees and agents. The SNAP-Ed Land-Grant University Program Development Team, SCSU, and the above-named parties, employees, and agents are not responsible for and do not verify for accuracy any of the information contained in the podcast series available for listening. The primary purpose of this podcast series is to educate and inform. This podcast series does not constitute professional advice or services. The developers of SNAP-Ed LGU Mentor in Your Pocket and the above-named parties assume no liability for any activities in connection with this podcast or for use of this podcast in connection with any other website, computer, playing device, or use of any information contained in the podcast. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not copy, edit, modify, or redistribute. This podcast is intellectual property of South Dakota State University and cannot be used without permission. To inquire about permissions for using this content, reach out to LGU PDT at lgusnaped@gmail.com.